to welcome everyone who has joined us here today. We are particularly grateful to Citigroup for making this type of activity possible, and I'd like to ask Mike Shearer from Smith Barney, our local Citigroup representative, to say a few words on behalf of the Citigroup Foundation. Mike.
Thank you, Becky. Since 1989, we have supported the University of Michigan with close to $2 million in grants. That, of course, includes the endowed lecture series for the Ford School of Public Policy, for the Citigroup Lecture Series, and then the majority of the funding goes to the Graduate Business School, which is considered a key recruiting school for Citigroup businesses. We're strong believers that corporations and their employees have a responsibility to give back to both the communities in which they work and they live. That is why in 2005, the foundation gave almost $100 million, and that's both domestically and reaching more than 80 countries worldwide, obviously. Our foundation has three priorities. One is financial education. An example can be found in Junior Achievement, Operation Hope, ACORN. Educating the next generation, examples of like UNICEF, Outstanding Teacher Scholarship Programs, and building communities and entrepreneurs. Examples will be like in the YMCA, Habitat for Humanity. Education is of primary importance to Citigroup, and that's why we are pleased to be partnered with the University of Michigan, which matches all three of these priorities very nicely. We seek to strengthen the quality of teaching, improve student achievement, and increase the access to higher education. By enhancing educational opportunities, we will hope to better prepare the next generation for both personal and professional success. 7 years ago, the world's preeminent financial institution decided to expand its presence in Ann Arbor, and I'm happy to say that our Smith Barney office is now going on the 7th year serving the Ann Arbor community. The dedication of the staff and the volunteers of the school is appreciated by all. And again, we look forward to the timely comments and insightful comments of General Petraeus. And again, sir, we thank you for the great effort, the tremendous sacrifice both you and the troops have made for all of us here at home. Thanks. And as always, Dean Blank, we thank you for the opportunity to participate in the lecture series. Thank you.
It is a singular honor and a real pleasure to welcome Lieutenant General David Petraeus as our Citigroup speaker today. Recognized as one of America's best leaders in 2005, he is currently the commander of Fort Leavenworth and the U.S. Army Combined Center. This post is a highly important one in the military. It's known as the intellectual center of the Army, and General Petraeus is responsible for overseeing the training programs of future military leaders. General Petraeus had the opportunity to acquire his military knowledge in a variety of both domestic and international settings, and in both staff and command positions. After serving as executive assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he was in Europe as an assistant to the Supreme Allied Commander at NATO headquarters. He's also been deployed with the United Nations, was Chief of Operations for the UN forces in Haiti, and served as a member of the Operations and Counterterrorism staffs in the NATO mission in Bosnia-Herzegovina. His time overseas includes 3 tours in the Middle East, once with Operation Desert Storm in Kuwait and twice in Iraq. He commanded the 101st Airborne Division from 2002 to 2004, during which he oversaw elections and restoration efforts in Mosul, Iraq's 3rd largest city. His most recent overseas posting was as commander of the NATO training mission and chief of the Office of Security. In this role, and as first commander in the Multinational Security Transition Command in Iraq, General Petraeus was responsible for organizing recruitment, supply, and training of all the Iraqi security forces. Under his supervision, the Iraqi Military Academy reopened with an all-Iraqi training staff, and thousands of security forces were trained, supplied, and put into the field. General Petraeus was the first American general to receive the Gold Award of the Iraqi Order of the Date Plum from the new Iraqi government for outstanding service to the Iraqi people. Finally, I should note that I first met General Petraeus at the Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton, New Jersey, when he was completing a PhD in industrial relations. I was then a very junior faculty member, and Jim Levinson up here was a graduate student in economics as well. All of us have acquired somewhat more important titles since then, but David is someone who's made a real difference in this world in ways that I can only admire. He has demonstrated his capacity for leadership in the most challenging and the most important military arenas of our time. He will be speaking with us today about his experiences in Iraq. Following his presentation, we're going to have time for questions, and all of you in your program should have a card, a white card in the program, and if you have questions that arise during the talk and also after the talk, there are people posted on either side. If you can pass your questions down to the end, we'll be collecting them down here and reading them, and give General Petraeus a chance to respond to the questions and the concerns of the audience. And now I present to you Lieutenant General David Petraeus.
Well, thanks for those kind words, Becky. Thanks for admitting that you knew me when I was a mere graduate student there at the good old Woodrow Wilson School. And it really is a pleasure to follow you at the podium this evening. In fact, by all accounts, the Ford School is very fortunate to have you at its helm, and I believe it would be very much in order to applaud what you're doing here with your team at this wonderful institution and the way in which you're doing it. Well done to you. It is great to be in Wolverine country here. A few minutes ago, I mentioned to Dean Blank that I was reminded of Michigander hospitality and culture earlier today when, feeling thirsty after our flight in, I sauntered over to the concession stand at the Willow Run Airport to purchase a cold soda. "We don't carry soda here," said a pleasant sales lady with a welcome. I see, they gave me pretty good material this time, I guess, Paul. "You may want to try a bakery." "A bakery?" I asked, somewhat confused. I'm from New York. "But I see cases of soda stocked in the refrigerator right behind you there." "Oh," she said. Actually, it's "oh." That's pop. "You see, here in Michigan, soda is for baking, and pop is for drinking," she said, handing me a Werner's ginger ale. "We also stock Faygo pop, but the truck hasn't come in yet, and you don't look like the imported pop type anyway." "You're a good judge of character," I offered. "So, have you traveled far?" she asked. "All the way from Kansas," I responded. "Wow," she continued, "you live farther away than most Yoopers." Not having a clue what a Yooper was, I thought it might be wise not to ask. "Have you ever been to Kansas?" I asked instead. "No," she replied, seeming to enjoy the conversation, "but I did just get back from a coast-to-coast trip." "Ah," I said, thinking about the splendid scenery she must have enjoyed while traversing our beautiful nation. "Yes," she said, "Port Huron to Muskegon." And she proudly traced the route on her right hand for me. I think it goes from the thumb to the... "But I'm originally from Midland, right here," she said, using her hand as a geographic information system and pointing at the base of her right index finger. "Well, it was very nice to meet you," I replied, "but I must be going. I'm expected on campus shortly." "Good luck," she said. "Be thankful that it's still winter and that our other season hasn't started yet. That's when the Michigan lefts really become difficult for our out-of-state visitors to navigate." "The other season?" I asked, opting once again for the easier question rather than tackling the potentially more sensitive concept of whatever Michigan left is. "Yes," she explained, "the construction season." Well, there I stood, steeped in Michigan culture with a Werner's in one hand, a bag of better-made chips in the other, and just before I turned to depart, she winked and said, "Have a wonderful visit to the campus, and be sure to come back and see me if those lions in front of the Natural History Museum roar." I don't know what any of this means. I did not dare ask, but perhaps after my remarks, somebody could explain some of this to me as well. It is really a great pleasure to be here at the University of Michigan, be able to share a few thoughts with you all today, even if it's clear that this part of the country still hasn't gotten the word that it's the beginning of spring. But it is good to be in Wolverine country, especially after a football season that may have had its ups and downs, I know, but did include victory over the Spartans at East Lansing in overtime. I have, by the way, on good authority that there are actually a few Spartan fans inside the perimeter here, so we don't want to laugh too loudly. I've offered to consult on force protection measures to the dean They're in civilian clothes, so don't worry. But before I begin, a few additional thanks in order as well. First of all, special thanks to Mike Shearer, there you are, and to Monica Goba and all the others at Citigroup Foundation who make the lecture series possible. And I want to offer a special thank you as well to the faculty and staff members in attendance today. As everyone here recognizes and is well known throughout the country, the strength of the University of Michigan and of the Ford School in particular, what makes it truly special has always been professors who place great importance on teaching and advising their students, often at the expense of their own research, writing, and other pursuits, and staff members who truly go out of their way to help students too. And it's a pleasure to see a number of members of the faculty and staff in the auditorium today, and I'd like to ask all of them to rise so that we can appropriately recognize and thank them as well. Please stand up if you're a faculty member. Thank you. Good. It's clear that all these individuals live your university's motto of Artes Scientia Veritas, which I'm told is Latin for "we're better than Ohio State." Which, by the way, I for one never doubted, not for a moment, even last November. What's 4 points? I'd also like to thank Major General Tom Cutler, Adjutant General of the great state of Michigan, members of the Michigan National Guard, and the leadership and cadets from all the ROTC programs who are here this evening as well. It's great to see all the uniforms. In fact, seeing all the military services represented also brought to mind a story that I heard recently. It took place in the Nichols Arcade Barber Shop, which serves many of the members of the various ROTC detachments and local military units. And it goes like this. A Marine gunnery sergeant who works at the Naval Detachment walked into the shop. "What'll you have?" asked the barber. "A good high and tight," responded the Marine, "white wall sides and only a half-inch on top." So the barber gave him a good close high and tight. "How much do I owe you?" asked the Marine. "Nothing," responded the barber. "You're serving our country in a time of war and I couldn't possibly take your money." So the Marine drew himself up to full attention, saluted, barked Semper Fi, walked out to his new red pickup truck with Marine Globe and Anchor decal on the back window, and drove away. And the next day on the steps of his shop, when he arrived in the morning, the barber found a red Marine PT shirt and a Marine coin. That afternoon, an Air Force pilot with duty at the 127th Wing sauntered in. "What'll you have?" asked the barber. "A very light trim," responded the pilot. "Just a bit off the sides, nothing off the top, and please don't touch the ponytail." I hope the Michigan Adjutant General is still in the audience. And take your time. I've already flown my 8 hours this month, and the Officers Club at Selfridge Air Force Base doesn't open for another 2 hours. So the barber gave him a nice leisurely haircut, not touching the ponytail, and once again, when asked how much, replied, "You're serving our country, I couldn't possibly accept your money." The Air Force officer responded, "Aim high," put on his sunglasses, tossed off a salute, got into his 2006 dark blue Corvette with silver pilot's wings on the front license plate, and roared away. And the next morning, on the steps of his shop, the barber found a pair of aviator sunglasses and a scarf from the pilot squadron. Early that afternoon, an Army ROTC cadet strode briskly into the shop, a TI-89 scientific calculator in one hand, his notes from Professor Justin Thomas's statistics class in the other, and a BlackBerry and a cell phone on his belt. "I need a good Army haircut," he said to the barber, "but please make it quick. I'm a fourth-year ROTC cadet studying political science, and I'm a very busy guy with a seminar, a workout, and an honors lecture still to go today." So the barber gave him a quick Army haircut, and once again, when asked how much, the barber replied, "You're serving our country, I couldn't possibly take your money," etc., etc. So the cadet thanked him, slung his backpack over his shoulder, strode out to his 6-year-old Trek mountain bicycle, pedaled past the undergraduate library without stopping because, of course, nobody goes to the ugly to study, and soon arrived at the graduate library where he descended into the solitude of the stacks to hit the books. And the next morning, on the steps of his shop, the barber found waiting for him in the morning 5 more Army ROTC cadets. Well, please don't ask me to tie that into my remarks today, but it was too good to pass up, and I assure you that any resemblance to individuals on this campus in Lansing with the National Guard or at Selfridge Air Force Base is purely coincidental. And please, Air Force, don't cancel my flight tonight. Well, my focus this afternoon is on Iraq, and in particular on observations that I took from my time there. As the Dean just shared with you, I returned from Iraq last fall after having served in that country for the bulk of our first 2.5 years there. Initially as the commander of the 101st Airborne Division, then doing a several-week short-notice assessment of the Iraqi security forces in the spring of 2004, and then over 15 months as the head of the so-called Train and Equip mission. And I'd like to share with you some observations that I think are the most significant for my participation in the operations in Iraq during my time there. And after that, I would be happy to take your questions, and if you like, talk briefly about the status of the Iraqi security forces, how we're incorporating the lessons learned in Iraq in the U.S. Army, or any other topic of interest. Well, let's go ahead and now, like any good Army officer, I'm also a PowerPoint ranger, and I will use these to illustrate the various points that I want to make. If we could have the first slide, please. The first lesson that we took from Iraq, a lot of us, was how right T.E. Lawrence, good old Lawrence of Arabia, was when he wrote years ago, back in his own time in that region, about not trying to do too much with your own hands, but helping the others do it with theirs. He went on to say, oh, by the way, the perfect solution in your mind may actually not be so perfect in their culture after all. And so we did very much subscribe to the idea of helping versus doing. About helping good local leaders after you identify them and can piece together structures that are multi-ethnic, that are representative of their populations, don't have blood on their hands, and so forth. And in fact, in the 101st Airborne Division area in northern Iraq, we worked very, very hard to get an interim government in place very early on, and it did, in fact, enjoy a good degree of success. It was quite representative, and it did, in fact, include all the different tribal elements, technocrats, imams, Christian bishop, educators, professors. In fact, Mosul University is about like this university, not quite as big, actually 35,000 students, and so on. And we think it was a very, very important thing to do. I'll talk more about Iraqi leaders at the end because, as you all know, that is the key to success in the way ahead there now. Next slide, please. The second observation, there are 14 of these, so you can keep track. The second one was that particularly in a location like Iraq, where the expectations were extraordinarily high when we went in. In fact, we used to be constantly confronted with what we call the man in the moon analogy, and they used to say to us, General, you know, you Americans could overthrow Iraq in 3 weeks, you could put a man on the moon, why can't you just give us electricity or water or whatever it might be, a basic need? And the truth was, frankly, because it was much harder. In many, many respects, not the least of which is in more, let's say, the last 2 years, just because of insurgent activity attacking certain elements of the infrastructure. But they had enormous expectations. There was a sense that Iraq was the Japan of the Middle East, that all it needed was just to get rid of Saddam and it would take off by itself. In truth, there were 30 years of repressive policies, of being ruled by truly a kleptocrat, which is really what Saddam was, both an autocrat and a kleptomaniac, if you will, stealing from the Iraqi people with his regime and really damaging the society enormously through this enormously repressive means of ruling, which in many respects drove initiative out of the people and affected so many, many different families and citizens in the country. So going in there, certainly regarded, certainly in many parts of the country, as an army of liberation, as we did the fight to Baghdad, frankly, throughout the South, we were in fact greeted as liberators, and in large measure that in the South is still generally the way that the U.S. and the coalition are regarded. Over time, however, we knew very early on that we had a half-life to that army of liberation, and the point of this is to say that this is a race against the clock. A number of us had done some of this before. We had a number of leaders in the 101st Airborne Division in particular. We had an entire brigade that had done a tour in Kosovo not long before, another brigade that had literally just gotten back from Afghanistan. A number of us had served in Central America, in Haiti, in Bosnia, and in that region before. and there was a clear recognition that you got to hit the ground running and you got to get after it. And it's an enormous lesson, and I think that Michael Gordon's book and some of the others very much underscore the importance of recognizing that the clock is ticking from the moment you hit the ground, and you got to get after it and you got to get early wins. We certainly tried to do that, particularly in our area. You can extend the half-life of the Army of Liberation, if you will, by good deeds, by clearly and truly trying to help the people. But in a situation like that, over time, you are going to inconvenience the people. You will injure some of them, in some cases by mistake. You will frustrate them. And over time, this will gradually build up to the point that they will start to regard you as occupiers. Interestingly, that is not the case yet in Afghanistan. I came home through there last fall, in fact, at the SecDef's request to look at the train and equip mission over there. In large measure there because they were so absolutely exhausted by all the fighting that had taken place, because they had nothing at all. The expectations were much lower, and therefore that is still largely viewed as an Army of Liberation, the forces that are there from the coalition, from NATO and the United States. The key again is you got to go fast. Next slide. We learned very, very early on that money is ammunition in what we were doing over there. And early on, we frankly were challenged to get it. We told Ambassador Bremer, for example, when he made his first, I think his first or second trip out of Baghdad was to Mosul. In fact, we actually walked the streets with him, had a terrific visit with him. And at the end of that, when he asked me, General, what do you need? I said, Ambassador, we need money. I had literally spent all of our operational funds, which were peanuts. I mean, I'm talking tens of thousands of dollars, nothing in what we were trying to get done for school supplies. And we were trying to rebuild major elements of the infrastructure to do a lot of work with restoring basic services, buying equipment for security forces, and all the rest of that. And I told him, you know, during the fight to Baghdad, with a single radio call, we could launch it was called an ATACMS missile, an Army Tactical Missile System missile. It cost about $550,000 each. We launched 113 of these. And now we're trying to get a small amount of money, and the bureaucracy is killing us. Can you help us out? To his credit, he did go back to Baghdad. And I said, oh, by the way, you know, we captured $1 billion, which we turned over to folks. And starting to wonder about that now. But, you know, if nobody's going to use this, how about putting it in the back of a plane and start down in Basra, take off, and start throwing it out, stimulating the economy. Please don't run out of all of it until you get up to Mosul. I was partly joking. The truth is he went back and he did, in fact, free up that $1 billion that had been found in walls and all the other places that Saddam and his henchmen had hid it. And that did help stimulate. That was the so-called CERT money. In fact, some of the military in here probably were involved in that. Commander's Emergency Reconstruction Program. We eventually, in the north and in the 101st area, spent about $53.5 million in the first year that we were up there, which is a very, very small amount when you are trying to do what we tried to do. By contrast, over time, the train and equip mission budget is now up over $12 billion. Now, a lot of that's still being spent. But again, you got to come at this not only fast, but big, and you've got to get going very, very quickly. We actually did a business deal here, by the way. That one's up there. In fact, the good training from the great Woodrow Wilson School taught us a lot about economics, brought a couple of PhDs over from Princeton, and guys in uniform. And we actually did, in fact, pull off investment deals that Citigroup would have been proud of. There were only about 16 or 17 millions, but that was enough to rebuild that place in that location at that time. You could get a lot for your money. Next slide, please. The whole idea needed to be not about winning hearts and minds for us, although we certainly wanted to do that, obviously, because it extends the half-life of the Army of Liberation. But what we recognized very early on was most important was giving the people a stake in the success of their new country. And sadly, there are an awful lot of Sunni Arabs that over time came to feel that they did not have a stake in the success of their new country. And of course, one of the issues that Ambassador Khalilzad and General Casey are encouraging the Iraqi government to address is the sense that there are tens of thousands of Sunni Arabs that do not feel that they have, again, that reason to want the new Iraq to succeed. Again, it's been an effort for quite a while. I am convinced Ambassador Bremer did intend to do reconciliation as well as de-Baathification. He allowed us, he personally gave us an exception for a while that helped us enormously. And then that issue was really taken out of his hands, as he wrote in his book, by some senior members of the Iraqi Governing Council who hijacked the de-Baathification process. Big challenge, it still exists. It's something that the Iraqis will have to deal with now very much. The key again, though, is looking at each policy, each program, each initiative, and asking, will this create more Iraqis with a stake in the success of the new Iraq or not? And if the answer to that is no, you need to think real hard before you do it. And we did ask that question of ourselves each time that we looked at launching a new program. And again, we think that did help us at our level to try to get the right to navigate these efforts during the times that we were mentoring the new interim government and so forth. Next slide. There is an operational question that we used to ask as well, and it's the one that's right up here. Because what you want to do is you ideally want to end each day with fewer enemies than you had when you started it. It's a tall order, very difficult, of course, but one way is to constantly test anything you're going to do by asking, will this create more bad guys by the way it's conducted than it takes off the streets? And again, if the answer to that is that it's going to create more bad guys, you need to look very, very hard at it, and you need to figure out how you can do the operation in a way that will be targeted, will not antagonize large neighborhoods or segments of the population when you're going after one or two or three key individuals. There are times when I would have been willing to very much risk a no answer to that question. One of those was, in fact, when we killed Uday and Qusay in Mosul. We did offer them an opportunity to surrender. We did, in fact, go into the house 2 times with Special Mission Unit members that were augmenting our force for that operation. We had 3 of them wounded, 1 of our soldiers, and then we decided that they clearly were not going to come out. There was no way, and that is when we, in fact, engaged the house with very precision anti-tank missiles. The fact is that did not cause large damage in the neighborhood. Had we dropped a bomb, which in fact there were some that were at least considering that, or used maybe a tank or something like that, then it might have been a different matter. But in this case, we found a way to do that. But I would have been willing to take a good bit of risk in that particular case. Next slide. The key in fulfilling that previous imperative of conducting operations in a targeted manner so that you can get individuals precisely and without doing sweeps whenever possible is intelligence. A counterinsurgency is all about intelligence. It's about precision intelligence. It's about having sufficient actionable intelligence that you can do what we did in one case where we did 35 simultaneous targets at 2 o'clock in the morning in Mosul and got 23 of the ones that we were after, with only 1 shot fired in the entire endeavor. They all went down simultaneously. We had precision on where we were going. We had a 10-digit grid coordinate. We knew precisely the description of the individual we were after. We had the atmospherics in the neighborhoods. We had routes planned. We had it all drilled to the detail, and that is hugely important. Again, but it all starts with intelligence. We have put a great deal of emphasis on this, as you might imagine, in the preparation of units that have gone back there since, along with a whole host of other training and leader development changes that we've made that I'd be happy to talk about during the question and answer period. Next slide. Early on, we went in there, and one of the big decisions, frankly, in our area was that we were going to get involved in a major way in the whole civil affairs endeavor. It is not optional. It would be wonderful if civil affairs battalions alone could do it. It would be wonderful if all kinds of non-governmental organizations and other national organizations and others all showed up to do it. But if that is not the case, you've got to get on with it, and the military has the ability to do that and has enormous capacity and capability. I should have mentioned earlier back in the money slide, in fact, that those 2 words, capacity and capability, are what this is all about. You have to have those. A handful of people do not represent much capacity, as good as they may be. We had some spectacular individuals that came up to help us that spoke fluent Kurdish and Arabic and everything else. But again, those are armies of one, and they're very small armies. You need large organizations that have their own communications, that have their own security, that can support themselves. And by the time our units were on the ground, the 101st Airborne Division, for example, had 250 helicopters alone. It had about 6,000 or 7,000 vehicles. We had tactical satellite communications that linked all of our units, long-haul comms. We had 28 operational lawyers, and I'll never ever say anything again about lawyers that are in uniform, at least, because they were phenomenal, and you can throw them at problems like a border opening that we did, or these investment deals, or a whole host of other activities that we did, and they provide us excellent advice at various times. We had reverse osmosis water purification units, well drillers, 4 engineer battalions with an engineer group headquarters that exists to do, they're all professional civil engineers who do assessment, design, contracting, QA, and QC. What we needed in the beginning was money. It started going, and it built over time, but again, big lesson there about capacity and capability. Now, civil affairs are not enough. I love civil affairs unit. I couldn't believe our good fortune when we got up in the north and we found that we were going to have 2 entire civil affairs battalions attached to us. It's a colossal number of these very limited national assets that our country has. And, but as we surveyed what we needed to do, we recognized that the challenges were staggering. Mosley University is a great example of that. We had a governor in place, we had a province council, all interim. We sat down with them, we had the security piece going pretty well, had cops back on the street and the rest of that, and sat down with them and said, okay, what's your next priority? And interestingly, they said Mosley University, which was a bit of a, I mean, it showed the commitment. By the way, it shows how much the Iraqi middle class has always treasured education. And Mosul's a fairly educated city. Mosley University is their second most prestigious university, second to Baghdad. And again, it's like a University of Michigan size organization, a little bit smaller, but 4,000 staff and faculty, about 100 major Capitol buildings and so forth. All of that had been looted. They told me that, and so I drove over there after that meeting. We went driving around there with the chancellor, by the way, about a 67-year-old professor, educated in the UK, PhD from there, and he had about 18 or 19 colleges, each of which has a dean. So you get a sense this is a big endeavor. Again, sadly, all of it had been looted before we got up there on the ground during the period of what was essentially lawlessness in the north, because we were not able to bring a unit in from Turkey, as you probably know. So went touring around in there, and then from there I went over to see the Civil Affairs Battalion commander, sat down with him, said, okay, big guy, what do you got? You know, we need to rebuild Mosul. He said, sir, we got this great education team, got a young captain, taught elementary school one time, got a couple of sergeants, you know, got a couple of specialists as drivers. I said, man, you know, have you been over there? You see the size of this? This is not, you know, a little rural elementary school. This is a major university. I actually said, I must confess, Michigan State at the time, but you know, now that I've been to Ann Arbor, I'll never make that mistake again. So anyway, he got it though. And so, you know, I said, okay, let me go back to the command post and get with all the designated thinkers and see what we can come up with. And what we did come up with is we had 2 aviation brigades. One of those was engaged doing raids back into Anbar province. We had one other that was not that heavily engaged, called up the brigade commander, told him, congratulations, Colonel, you won the lottery, you're going to rebuild Mosul University. It's amazing what happens when you give an organization a mission, give them pretty wide lines on the road, tell him to get after it, tell him to come tell you what he needs in terms of resources, give him about half of what he asks for and tell him to get after it, just like the university. Anyway, so and I said, by the way, take in that captain and her sergeants and all the rest of that and get them engaged in this as well. It turned out to be a great model. We did that for every single ministry activity throughout northern Iraq, and it really paid off. For example, we had a signal battalion. These are big-time signal comms now. I mean, these are satellite shots and all the rest of that. And they helped rebuild all the fiber structure and everything else up there, including, by the way, several hundred kilometers of donated fiber optic cable from Bell South that managed to find its way in a logistics aircraft from Fort Campbell, Kentucky. So they partnered with the Ministry of Telecommunications. Our chaplain partnered with the Ministry of Religious Affairs. By the way, we had an imam as a chaplain, an actual U.S. Army imam, and did a terrific job for us. And then we had some others that weren't functionally aligned. We had a core support group. He aligned with the Ministry of Education. That's the elementary and high schools. We had another that did youth and sports, got 150 soccer teams going and all this kind of stuff. Everybody had a task, and then there were individuals. Everybody had a portfolio. In fact, my portfolio was the governor of Nineveh province and then the two senior Kurdish leaders, Masoud Barzani, the leader of the Kurdish Democratic Party, KDP, and Jalal Talabani, who's now the president of Iraq, actually, who is the leader of the PUK, and got after it. And again, when you're trying to do industrial strength rebuilding, you've got to give mission type orders. You've got to say, here's what I want you to do. Get out there, get after it, get going. Let me know what you're doing if you have a chance. Oh, by the way, if you don't have a chance, don't worry. Keep going and I'll come out and see what you're doing. And if you're outside the white lines, I'll tell you. By the way, we had 2 or 3 of our 9 infantry battalion commanders. We had about 40 or 45 battalion commanders total. But the infantry were key because they controlled ground. And there's probably 2 of those that really weren't that enamored of nation building. And the word came back to me, and I sort of checked this out. And I mean, there's one guy that all he was doing was going on every single raid his unit did every night, because that's what manly men do. And his battle rhythm was phenomenal. He got up about 10 in the morning, he lifted weights for an hour. You know, we brought our weights with us. This is the 101st Airborne. So, and we had pull-up bars. But anyway, so he's getting after it, and he'd get the update for that night's operation, go through the rehearsal, and then he'd go out the gate with the unit. You know, really admirable stuff, sharing risk at the point of decision, all the rest of that. The problem was I needed him doing nation building. So we put the word out a couple days. I said, I'm going to come down there, brigade commander and assistant division commander, get the word to this guy that I want to go down there and confirm his excellence in the plan on nation building 3 days from now. Of course, they went the day before and the day before that. And by the time we got down there, by God, you know, he was exhausted. I said, what have you been doing? Oh, sir, I've been delivering air conditioners to imams all day. So anyway, that's what you got to do. Next slide. And the 3rd ID guy knows that too. Okay, you got to build not just battalions, brigades, divisions. And we learned this big time. You got to build institutions. And in fact, the institutional mission was given to the organization that I commanded when I was last there about a month or so before I left. In fact, now the challenge in Iraq in the future, I think, is going to be ministries. It is the ministries of finance through which all this enormous oil wealth has to flow to get to other ministries to get out to do any good for the Iraqi people. It's an enormous challenge. They were incredibly hidebound bureaucrats in the past. These are very tiny pinholes through which decisions and money have to pass still, and it's something that needs a great deal of attention. And I want to assure you, when I went back and did some calls in Washington after coming home last fall, that I made that very, very clear to the folks with whom I met at that time. It's a lot easier to build infantry battalions than it is to build logistical structures, to build ministries, military academies, staff colleges, branch schools, training bases, and all the rest of that. You got to do it all, and you got to try to do it simultaneously if you can. Next slide. Very big truism. Anybody that's any student at all of counterinsurgency operations knows that you can lose it militarily, but you're not going to win it militarily. You're going to win it politically. And over time, that is what has to be done. Over time in Iraq, there will be a political solution. There has to be a government of national unity. It has to reach out to those Sunni Arabs who are rational and would be willing to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem, thereby stripping them off from the true, no kidding, foreign extremists and national extremists, the Saddamists who will never come in from the cold, and the violent criminals, many of whom were let out of jail by Saddam in the fall of '02. These are critical elements to all of it, but if you do an equation that says, you know, drawdown of U.S. forces equals, there are an awful lot of factors in there, and probably the biggest coefficient goes in front of the factor that has to do with political environment. Because in the 12 or so of 18 provinces where things are going fine, the reason is because the people are okay with the political situation in those areas. It's obviously the 9 southern provinces, it's the 3 Iraqi Kurdish provinces, and then it's actually really parts of 2 of the remaining 6. But in that Sunni Arab dominated area and Baghdad, which of course is very mixed, there, in those cases, you don't have that. It's why you have the sectarian strife, and again, it has to be addressed by Iraqi political leaders. Next slide. You know, we've learned over and over how important it is to understand the culture in which you're operating. I mentioned to the dean earlier today that, believe it or not, one of the big things that a civilian graduate school does for an Army officer is teach them that there are some really bright folks out there in the world that don't have the same basic assumptions about life in general, core values perhaps, and all the rest of that. And that's a pretty good preparation for going into a foreign culture, frankly, because again, very bright people there have different approaches to life. Believe it or not, if you live a bit of a cloistered existence with your nose to the grindstone all the time, the way we occasionally do in the military, this is an extraordinary experience. And by the way, I'm happy to report our Army is going to send several hundred additional officers, young officers, to graduate school each year, and the Ford School's got its hand up, and they'll get their share, I'm sure. Again, this is what you have to understand. And interestingly, these are members of the province council up there in Nineveh province, and I can still look at each of these and remember the background of the individual, if he was from a political party, what his views would be on many of the different issues and all the rest of that. And we had to do an awful lot of this right there. That's a brigade commander sitting with the deputy governor of that particular province. Next slide. It all comes down at some point to local leaders. About a year ago, a lot of us started saying, hey, the good news is this is approaching the point where Iraqi leaders can take this forward. The challenging news is this is approaching the point where Iraqi leaders have to take it forward. And it's leaders that'll start at the national level with individuals like these right here, again, forming that government of national unity. It will include developing capacity and capability in the ministries so that the resources of Iraq, which are phenomenal. Iraq is not just sitting on the second largest oil resources in the world. It has something no other country in the region has, and that is water. It's the land of the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. That also means it has incredible agriculture. It has a phenomenal irrigation system still, even though it was totally, really ignored by Saddam in the final 10 years and required a lot of repair. But again, these ministries are the key to providing for the basic needs of the Iraqi people, and they have to be supported by the national leaders. At the province level, they can't do winner-take-all politics, which is really what Iraq has been about an awful lot of its existence, and that's going to be a challenge. And then, of course, in the security forces, they have to have leaders that have, again, sort of the values that I think most military leaders in the world would subscribe to, where you look to your soldiers' needs first and then to yours. You share their risk, you share their hardship, and you deal with them equitably on the basis of their ability as soldiers, not because of their sectarian background, tribal affiliation, or political party. Next slide. We have a huge responsibility to these young individuals called here the strategic corporals or the strategic lieutenants. They are people who are out on the perimeter of a hasty perimeter of a raid. They're the people who have put in a traffic control point on short notice. They are people who are therefore making, in the blink of an eye, life or death decisions about whether the car approaching them at a high rate of speed is a suicide car bomber or just somebody who didn't read the sign and blew right past the light that was flashing. It's enormously important so that we can minimize having to stop vehicles like that. And of course, in some cases, not only are these life or death situations, there are situations that have strategic consequences if you get them wrong. We owe an obligation, again, as I said, we have an obligation to these individuals. We must continue to improve the training that they get for the situations that they face in places like Iraq, and we've got to help them shape the situation with better, simple technology. I mean, just how do you stop a car so you don't have to put bullets in the window? How do you make sure that the sign is really visible at night in a country where people are on edge to begin with and nervous about whether it's a militia checkpoint or it's a legitimate coalition or security force checkpoint? Very, very challenging problem, and in truth, you cannot imagine how difficult the security environment is for soldiers who are working in a country where any person who approaches them could be a suicide vest wearer or could be driving a car with a bomb on it. Next slide. And that leads to this. You've got to have leaders who are flexible and adaptable, leaders who can perform tasks for which they may or may not have been trained, some tasks that they never even envisioned when they entered the service, when they went through their branch schools and their professional military education. Frankly, we have completely revamped our training all throughout our education system. At the combat training centers, what used to be the clash of the tank titans, the big tank battles in the Mojave Desert at the National Training Center, which we oversee, has now become a continuous insurgency where our soldiers, the opposing force soldiers, even are allowed to grow beards. They act like insurgents, and we even bring in 300 or so Iraqi role players who are honest-to-God Iraqis. They just now live in San Diego or Los Angeles, and they take great delight in playing these roles. We got about 2,200 different roles that we pick from for them to act out, and they do a great job. In fact, we were just out there recently using our survival Arabic with them, and it was a lot of fun. In fact, we found Kurds who were playing Shia, and it's the only place in the world where all the Kurds get together and all the Iraqis get together. I don't know what we do here in our country. Next slide. The last lesson is the most important when we're talking to U.S. military leaders, and we got a lot of future ones here. And that is that the number one job for the leader of a military organization in a challenging situation like this is to set the right tone. Now, the truth is that the dean would tell you that the most important job of a leader in any organization, and Citigroup would say the same, is to set the right tone for that organization. In a situation like Iraq, it very much begins with the right ethical tone. It includes clear instructions on treatment of detainees. It includes swift action if people get outside the white lines that have been put down for them, and dealing with the local population, again, with detainees and in a host of other cases. It includes very much finding that right mix of the kinetic, of the lethal activities, the traditional military actions, and the non-kinetic, the non-lethal activities, the nation-building aspects, in a sense, the softer side of things. And by the way, it changes constantly, because in a situation like this, what works in Mosul today won't work in Mosul tomorrow, it won't work in Tikrit today, and so on. And you have to, again, be flexible and adaptable enough to recognize that, and the guy at the top has to continually ensure that the right tone has been transmitted to his subordinate leaders and then echoed and re-echoed through the ranks all the way down to the bottom. It's a very, very big challenge and a very big responsibility. There is even one there in terms of dealing with the local population that we put in, because on occasion, I think we've overlearned cultural awareness to the point that we were always just endlessly polite, patient, hospitable, and so forth in dealing. But gosh, you know, they're getting emotional with us. On occasion, we actually have to show, in fact, the full range of emotions as well. And it's important to do that. Ideally, you have control of them as you're doing it, and it's not for real, but there's a little bit of acting that goes on out there as well. Next slide. Okay, those are the observations that I wanted to share with you, and I would now be very happy to take the questions, whoever's compiling them. Jim, if you want to go ahead and start firing away.
General Petraeus, is it realistic that American force levels can be reduced in light of the problems facing Iraqi security forces, including sectarian loyalties, infiltration by insurgents, and corruption?
Yeah, I think it is very much, actually. There have been no end to challenges in helping to build Iraqi security forces. And you can, take 20% off all the statistics. I can tell you that it has been a steady climb in terms of capabilities of those forces. Where in the summer of 2004, when the initial Iraqi government assumed the sovereignty of their country, there were virtually no Iraqi battalions, infantry battalions, fighting with our forces at all. There are now some, 55, I think it is, 55 police and army battalions that are at what are called in the lead, and another 70 or thereabouts that are in what's called the category of fighting alongside. We ought to pull that up. We actually have a slide so I make sure we don't misquote. But it's roughly around, there's in the neighborhood of 130, 140 battalions are actually in the fight. There's unevenness in some of the quality of the ones naturally that are more inexperienced than others, but those that we started building all the way back in 2004, the 1st Division, the 6th Division, the 2nd Division, others, they are actually doing quite well. And it does give you very much hope, I think, that if there can be a government of national unity, which again is the key ingredient to the way ahead, that they can very much allow us to draw down our forces. In fact, now that was long ago. Yeah, here's the actual. This is the latest. And this is an unclassified characterization because there's a classified, but we're always lower with the unclassified. So it's actually 70 in the lead now. So this is really, again, has continued a pretty substantial level of progress. This is the very latest one, I think, that literally just came out a week ago. So it's about half and half. Out of the 140 now, they're actually so-called in the fight. You can see about 70 are in the lead. Now, in the lead means that they still do need some assistance from our forces. And that could be as little as some logistical support. It certainly is medical evacuation in some cases, big fire support or something like that. But they're very, very much in the fight and increasingly in the lead. There's another statistic, if we can pull it up. I don't know if you have the one that shows where they have battle space. Next. Okay, that's a very, very important number there. And that's a metric that is hugely significant because, again, until probably certainly early 2005, there were no Iraqi battalions that owned their own battle space, as it's called. In other words, controlled their own area of responsibility. There are now 55 of those. And you can see a sizable number actually in Baghdad. I mean, that's 27 battalions. Each of these battalions averages somewhere around 800 men. They're a little bit smaller on the police side. They're larger on the Army side. But if you figure roughly 800, typically have about a fifth of those will be on leave at a time because they have to take their pay home every month and a half or so, and has been a big challenge in itself. But you can see that quite a few there. Interestingly, 9 battalions in Anbar province, which includes Fallujah. Most of those actually in Fallujah, where we put the 1st Division that was formed and is really a very, very good division. The challenge is pushing out to Ramadi and then out the Euphrates River Valley, which has been the focus of a lot of operations. And there are actually 2 full Iraqi divisions in Anbar province now that are very much operational, where again, back in, say, November of '04 during the operation of Fallujah, there was virtually nothing. So the answer is yes. The key is actually the political solution to this, though, because that will create the environment in which they can increasingly be successful. Next slide. I'm sorry, next question.
We've got quite a stack here.
Okay.
Would you comment on the apparent lack of accountability by commanding officers in the Abu Ghraib situation?
The reason I'm pausing is I just don't know what the level of accountability is. I mean, I'm not one that's ever investigated that. There's a lot of careers that are ended. I mean, I think to say that there's not accountability at pretty high levels, you'd have to ask, in fact, there's certainly well into the general officer ranks, this has had enormous repercussions. Now, that does not mean that they, went to jail, but there's a number of careers that ended. There's a colonel that was, not court-martialed, but very much disciplined in what's called the non-judicial punishment system. And then, and it's not over yet, I don't think. But don't make that a big quote. I mean, I don't know anything at all about it. I do know there are more cases that are coming. Next.
The grandfather of a Marine in Iraq asks, based on your experience with Iraq, what is the best thing an American citizen can do in their day-to-day life to contribute to the U.S. efforts there?
Well, believe it or not, I think it's actually being done. And that is, frankly, the level of support that the American people have provided to our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians and their families has been very, very important. The reason that our soldiers are re-enlisting at much, much higher levels than the goals, in fact, in places like Iraq and Afghanistan is clearly because of that. And I'm actually going to end briefly talk about that. Next, Jim.
Oh, okay. What is your opinion about the recent elections and the status of women? Is this is this a concern for the future of the country?
Well, as I recall, there's a mandate in the Constitution that women have to be a certain number in the National Assembly, which I can assure you is a vastly higher number than they ever had before. Interestingly, when we did the interim election in Nineveh province, in the beginning, we could not persuade them to allow women to be on the province council. We did eventually. By about October, November of that year, we actually were successful in getting them to add 4 women to the province council. Women have always played a very big role in Iraqi life. They have actually traditionally been very, very active in the medical field, the legal field, education field. Not necessarily, though, in the military, certainly, or in perhaps the inner circle, with a couple of exceptions. There was one very prominent female that you may recall. But there is much, much greater participation in the National Assembly than there ever has been, and it's by Constitution. So I think that that's actually a pretty big step forward for women in Iraq. That's not to say, again, there's not challenges, and that in some cases the resurgence of more fundamentalist forms of Islam is not running counter to that, because I think that's the concern that people have. Okay?
In the military, how do you teach adaptability?
It's a great question. There are a couple of ways that we think that you produce. We have this wonderful buzzword now. You know, military is very much into jargon, and of course we now have the Army pentathlete leader. The pentathlete leader, I guess, is somebody who's versatile and again has this quality of adaptability and the quality of flexibility that I talked about that's very important in this endeavor. Some of it actually comes from American culture. Some of it comes from the way we try to train people and in a sense challenge them in a lot of the basic military courses they get, with literally everything from leader reaction courses to what do you do now ranger exercises, what do you do now lieutenant, all these types of scenarios, field exercises and so forth. In our field exercises, unlike virtually any other countries until we started doing it, there is a free playing, thinking opposing force that can beat you, and in fact routinely beat us at the National Training Center and the Joint Readiness Training Center, kicked our butt. And so that is another part. What I was mentioning earlier to some of the students upstairs was that we think it is very important, actually, that there are 2 additional factors in this, one of which is an out of the intellectual comfort zone experience. And civilian graduate school is that for our military officers. And I don't mean that in any kind of humorous way, but I mean it's just you open up your eyes. I mentioned that I actually went from the Command and General Staff College, you know, we'd had a year of military academia, to the good old Woodrow Wilson School there at Princeton, and it was a pretty eye-opening experience for me, and I hadn't had a sheltered existence up to that point. So very, very good experience again. And then the other one is probably that we get folks in jobs where they can watch very senior folks make really tough decisions. I can tell you that it is a real experience to, and I've been very fortunate to have been the aide to an Army Chief of Staff, the exec to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Special Assistant to the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And when the door closes and everybody else is out of the room, to hear what they say is a pretty big education, particularly if you're wrestling with issues. The chairman on my watch did the air campaign in Kosovo, did Bosnia, did Desert Fox, and a couple of these others. And it's pretty great education to see them grappling with all of the challenges and the various forces that are all trying to work them. And so that's how we think that we're going about this. There's other pieces I could talk about, the great increase in cultural awareness training, again, trying to get people to understand how other people think, and specific language training and a variety of these others as well.
General, to what extent do Al Jazeera and other so-called hostile media impact U.S. success?
They have a pretty big impact, actually, and it's not a good one in many cases. On the other hand, before you criticize Al Jazeera, be willing to go on it. And it was frustrating to me on occasion that some folks would hammer Al Jazeera and badmouth it and everything else, and then you'd say, well, you know, they were looking for somebody to go on. Why don't you go on camera? I actually did it 4 times when I was in Iraq in different assignments. They always asked snide questions. They always had snide follow-ups, but they always translated what I said 100% accurately. And as you know, you don't have to answer the question they gave. You can give the answer you want. You know that old joke about the speaker, you know, the person asked the question, the speaker gave the answer, and the person stood up and did the follow-up and said, well, you didn't answer my question. And the speaker says, well, you didn't ask mine. So, I mean, you can, so I think very much, actually, we have to engage. We actually, by the way, another thing we actually have at Fort Leavenworth, we are the proponent for what's called the Information Operations functional area in our Army. And so we're actually a huge effort now to train people to work the information operations field. And this is not psyops or black stuff or, you know, illegal. This is just engaging appropriately and figuring out that if you're going to do a raid in this village tomorrow morning, send somebody along that then engages the people afterwards, follows up with it, explains to them why you did what you did, that goes on press ahead of time, or not ahead, but right away after it, and explains again why you did what you did and so forth.
General, there seems to be much debate about adequate troop size. Colin Powell advocated having a massive force, and this was very successful in the first Gulf War. Now Army scholars are taking lessons from Vietnam regarding the best size for fighting insurgents. What is your opinion on this issue?
My opinion is that it's an extraordinarily tough call, actually, because we have the situation, particularly now, frankly. I'm not going to go back and revisit history. You can read Michael Worden's book as well as I can, and I think there's some pretty clear items out of that. I was able to say when I was the commander of the 101st that we felt that we had enough forces for what we were asked to do, and I think the results did actually speak for themselves in that area. By the way, when I did go back as the commander of the Multinational Security Transition Command Iraq, or MNSTICI for short, the first thing I did was ask for several hundred additional very high-ranking officers and non-commissioned officers and a whole bunch of trainers and others, and $1.8 billion, and I got it. So there, in General Casey, every time he's asked for more troops, which I think is at least 3 times, for the 2 of the elections and a small, modest increase right now during the Shia Ashura celebration, that he has gotten them all the time as well. The problem is that we are very, very concerned at this point that we will create a dependency culture because the longer we stay in some respects is the longer they avoid taking stuff on. And this is a culture, again, in which everything was done for them. All decisions were made for them in the past in a lot of ways. I mean, I'm overstating this, but I mean, food was provided, there's a ration system, there's a ration card, there's the this, you know, oil is at, gasoline's at 1 point something cents a gallon. So again, there was a very much dependency culture that existed as it was on Saddam, which he wanted to create. And we don't want to perpetuate that. Obviously, we want, so it's a real test of, you know, when do you throw them in the deep end and how long do you let them bob up and down before you go get them again if you have to, or before they actually come to the top. And it's a real tough call. There is now also, clearly, I mean, there's just how quickly can you recycle units from the U.S. Army? How long can you keep asking soldiers, you know, at a very high rate to go back? The first unit is just back in Iraq for a full second-year tour. With all due respect to the 3rd Infantry Division, many of them got out of there well before a year. The first time, about 6 months, probably on average for most. There were some, to be fair, that did stay a long, long time because they sat there in Kuwait for a while. But the 101st Airborne Division is actually the first unit back there now for a second full-year tour. They seem to be hanging tough. I think their re-enlistment rates are fine, but we have to keep that in mind. The Army actually has increased. You know, it's got about 30,000 extra soldiers over what its authorization was. But at the end, they want to get it on back down.
You mentioned that every liberation movement has a half-life, and at some point, the liberators presumably become occupiers. When that happens, what's a well-meaning liberator to do?
I don't think you ever stop trying to be a liberator. And the truth is, it's not a light switch, and there's still enormous amount of gratitude to you for what you've done. But there's also, they will say, look, General, okay, let us do this one. And of course, you say, I'm happy to have you do it. Now, the challenge is that not in all cases is there the capacity and the capability to do it. And then again, you have to remain engaged. But I think you have to continue, certainly, very sincerely and truly to keep trying to help and keep trying to do all that you can. I mean, you can actually regain sometimes trust that may have been lost and so forth as well, just by being honest. I mean, all of our units made mistakes. The question is, what do you do when you find that out? And the answer is, you make it right as quickly as you can, and you explain it to people, and you make amends for it. I mean, Iraq actually has a huge history of this, and they have something called salacious pay. And if somebody is hurt or killed, and if it's a mistake, and that stuff happens in the kind of environment that you're in over there, you go make a salacious payment personally, apologize personally, and actually that, frankly, in that culture, all is generally forgiven. So now, if you stonewall it, if you deny it, if you don't admit it, if you don't, then you got a problem on your hands.
Our last one.
Okay.
Do you believe that the U.S. press is presenting an accurate picture of what is being done in Iraq? If not, how does one learn more?
Okay. Let me start off by giving a little vignette. When we were actually sitting in Kuwait waiting to go through the berm in mid-March of 2003, and we're starting to feel, as you would imagine, this war is imminent and all the rest of this. And anyway, we're getting briefed one night. Public affairs officer stands up and proudly says, "Sir, here's a new slide." We have, again, all kinds of slides in the military. So here's a new slide. I'm going to start tonight grading the press on whether the stories are positive or negative. I said, okay, and I'm just trying to get through this darn briefing. So we went on, actually 3 slides later. Oh, stop, go back 3 slides. I said, I just don't think that's the right metric. You need to grade the press on whether it's accurate or inaccurate. That's all we can ask. But by God, if it's inaccurate, we ought to let them know that we are displeased with the fact that it is inaccurate. But if we crash a bunch of helicopters, if we lose a bunch of soldiers, that is clearly a negative story. But if it's reported accurately, that's all we can ask. We're not going to try to spin this thing, like a top or something like that, because it won't work. And again, there was, to some degree, an advantage of, watching real senior guys at real senior levels and learning, don't ever lie to the press, because it doesn't work. So that was what we tried to employ, and I think it actually stood us in pretty good stead. And I think the 101st was certainly one of the more open units to the press. Having said that, on several occasions, I went back to very senior people, including, in one case, the son of the former owner of a very, very important newspaper in America in Washington, and met with him and did discuss an article that I thought had completely missed the mark. And I mean, this is with a real senior guy now, the owner, and he took it extraordinarily well. They want to know when they have not done that. And you know who the editors are, you work with them. We went to a number at various times. The Wall Street Journal one time had a very damaging story. It was just flat wrong. And so we brought the writer in, called the editor, spent all night calling people to correct it. But by and large, having said that, by and large, I truly believe that most of the mainstream press, there's clearly press that is, without question not, but the mainstream press, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the others are trying to report accurately. And the challenge, though, now increasingly is that because it's so very difficult for the press to get out of very, very cocoon-like existences, that they are increasingly having to depend on others. In some cases, they're increasingly depending on Iraqi stringers. And Iraqi stringers know to some degree what sadly sells. And so there have been cases where we know stories that took place because we were there were really, really dramatized beyond all recognition by people who were actually there, not U.S. journalists, but then are providing the facts as they saw them to the journalists. And that is a very big challenge that the journalists are having to deal with now. But to be fair, I don't know how to do it better, because the difficulty of getting out and getting a story is enormous in an environment where you can be kidnapped, where you can be taken hostage and so forth. 99% of the time they could probably drive around just fine in Baghdad, but that other 1% is horrific. And as those other 1% accumulate, as you would imagine, the various organizations have really restricted their members of the press. I think the military does have to be more open at times. I mean, it very much depends on unit commanders and their comfort level with letting press come in. You know, sometimes we feel like the press has got to give us a break, and if, you know, one soldier whines, that doesn't become the story of the day or something like that. And I think in general, with most of them, that you can have that kind of relationship where they will characterize things properly and they'll report accurately. You know, as to how do you get a better feel, believe it or not, if you really truly want to get to learn as much as you can from the press, there's actually a defense news clipping service called the Early Bird, which I think is accessible, I think, from the outside. I may actually be wrong on that, but that would be the key, and it clips every single article that relates to Iraq, and it doesn't screen anything. I mean, it's the good and the bad, and it's very, very widely read certainly in the military, throughout the military, White House, Capitol Hill, and all the rest of that. So that's a great, great source, I think, of pretty good, and you can get a great feel out of that. Well, let me say a couple of words before closing, because I really feel an obligation to say something about the wonderful soldiers with whom I was privileged to serve downrange in recent years. There have, to be sure, been missteps by some of our troopers and units in Iraq and Afghanistan, and some of them have been very serious. But for each soldier who failed to live up to our country's expectations, there have been thousands of others who have selflessly gone about their mission, doing what they've been asked to do, enduring separation from loved ones, soldiering in crushing heat and sandstorms, battling a truly barbaric enemy, grappling with the complexities and frustrations of working in cultures that are very different from our own, and in some cases, shedding blood or giving the last full measure of devotion in carrying out their assigned missions. I'd like to briefly talk about one of the many great soldiers with whom I was privileged to serve in the 101st Airborne Division, Master Sergeant Luis Rodriguez, a great leader who loved being an Army medic and reveled in being doc to the infantrymen he supported. A highly competent, extremely professional NCO, he always led from the front and gave energy to all around him in the most difficult of times while serving as a medical platoon sergeant for one of our air assault infantry battalions. After 9 months of great work in Iraq, however, tragedy struck. On November 24, 2003, Master Sergeant Rodriguez's convoy was ambushed, and he bore the brunt of the attack. Hammered by shrapnel, he lost the tips of 2 fingers on his left hand and had his right leg severed just above the knee. Now the medical leader, who had repeatedly been the one to serve others, needed help from his comrades, and they got him to a field hospital very quickly. I flew to the hospital as soon as we heard about the attack and saw Master Sergeant Rodriguez shortly after he came out of the operating room. After pinning a Purple Heart on him, telling him how proud we were of him, and assuring him that he'd be in our prayers, I tried to make a little small talk, to update him on the condition of the other members of his platoon and to see how he was bearing up. What happened next will remain with me forever. Master Sergeant Rodriguez looked up at me, thanked me for my concern about him and his troopers, and asked me how I was doing. "I've been worried about you," he said. "The division's had a tough month, and I know it's had to be tough on you." I was stunned. Here's a man who's just lost a leg, and he's asking me how I was doing. But that concern for fellow soldiers is what typified and still typifies Master Sergeant Rodriguez and countless other soldiers with whom we served in the brotherhood of the close fight. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was evacuated to Germany and then to the United States, and he spent the next 4 months in an amputee ward at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, undergoing 16 surgeries and learning how to walk again with a new prosthetic leg with crutches. I visited him there as well and was surprised when he said that he wanted to stay in the Army and help train combat medics. Though we all supported that request, I wasn't sure whether it could work, though we pledged to do all that we could to help the Army get to yes. After a final operation, he was released to return home to his wife and their 2 daughters in Clarksville, Tennessee. But problems awaited him there as their home was small, had narrow halls, and didn't easily accommodate Master Sergeant Rodriguez's crutches and new needs. In fact, he could barely manage to get himself and his apparatus into the bathroom. Then his prayers were answered. He received a new high-tech prosthesis, and more importantly, he and his family were selected by ABC's Extreme Makeover Home Edition to receive a completely remodeled home. And this slide shows him and And he's here overcome by emotion, and that's the before and the after of his house. This was really one of those occasions when one feels that there truly is good in the world. Meanwhile, he continued his fight to stay in the Army to do the job he loves, training combat medics. And thanks to some great senior leaders in our Army demonstrating that same flexibility and adaptability I've talked about in my remarks, he was allowed to stay in uniform and was selected to be the non-commissioned officer in charge of the Combat Medical Training Facility at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Meanwhile, Master Sergeant Rodriguez's wife proved to be a hero in her own right. Not only did she provide enormous strength during her husband's ordeal, she started studying to be a social worker in order to become a counselor to families of soldiers who were killed or injured. This brave couple clearly took tragedy and turned it into triumph, and they are sterling examples of the wonderful, selfless individuals who serve our country on a daily basis. And the final photo shows Master Sergeant Rodriguez here teaching his class, and then when we got together a couple months ago back at Fort Campbell. I strongly believe, in fact, that all Americans should be very grateful for what their young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines have done and are doing in Iraq and Afghanistan and a host of other places around the world. Tom Brokaw, who you'll recall wrote The Greatest Generation, spent some time with the 101st when we were deployed in northern Iraq. Before getting on a helicopter after a particularly good day seeing the myriad tasks in which our troopers were engaged, he turned to me and said, "Surely these soldiers are the new greatest generation." I agreed with that then, and I still do. Repeatedly in Iraq, I saw the concept of the Army of One slogan played out, as soldier after soldier proved to be the decisive individual in the performance of a particular task at a particular place on the battlefield. In fact, I often wondered, especially while observing soldiers rendering a final salute to a fallen comrade after a memorial ceremony, where does our country find such individuals, young men and women who, despite the personal flaws that we all have, serve so selflessly and in the face of enormous challenges, repeatedly demonstrate impressive initiative, determination, innovativeness, and courage. I raise this today because as the discussion over Iraq continues, it's my hope that our country will never turn its back on those in uniform who have done what their country asked them to do, even though that duty required enormous sacrifice and entailed substantial hardship by them and by their families. And so this evening at this great university, at an event hosted by a school that celebrates public service, I want to express my hope that our country will never forget and never fail to honor the sacrifices of those who wear and have worn our country's uniform. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Stay up
Thanks
here
a
a
lot.
minute.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
General Petraeus, thank you very much for being with us today. In honor of your giving the Citigroup lecture, I want to present you with a plaque that cites you for distinguished leadership with America's Armed Forces. I want to thank everyone for coming. I particularly want to thank our guests from the National Guard as well as our guests from ROTC. I invite all of you to join us in a reception. It's just outside. General Petraeus and his staff are going to have to leave in about 10 minutes, but I hope you'll stay and linger and talk. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you all again very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.